Allow me to set the scene. Masonry, as practiced in the lodges under the supervision of Grand Lodges, is the foundation of the craft, and all other rites, orders, concordant bodies, and whatever organization that falls under that Masonic umbrella is subservient to the Grand Lodge in each jurisdiction. Royal Arch Masonry can only function legally with the approval of the Grand Lodge in each jurisdiction. Royal Arch Masonry is considered a concordant body of Masonry that exists to provide the completion and fulfillment of the Master Mason degree. Groups of Royal Arch Masons form themselves into chapters rather than lodges and operate under the supervision of a Grand Chapter functioning in each jurisdiction, much as a Grand Lodge functions. As the senior elected officer in the Grand Lodge is the Grand Master, the senior elected officer in Royal Arch Masonry is the Grand High Priest. In the American Rite, Royal Arch Masonry offers 4 degrees: Mark Master Mason, Past Master, Most Excellent Master, and the sublime degree of the Holy Royal Arch. These degrees, like the 3 craft degrees, are laden with symbolism and history. The mark, the keystone, a penny a day wages, the completion and dedication of the temple with the descending of the Shekinah and the placement of the keystone, and the amazing recovery of those treasured artifacts, including the long-lost word by the weary sojourners who traveled from Babylon to Jerusalem to assist in rebuilding the city and temple of the Lord. It is optional for Master Masons to seek admission into a chapter of Royal Arch Masons, which then starts them on a journey through the York Rite, which also includes councils of cryptic Masonry and commanderies of Knights Templar. This can lead to opportunities to be invited to membership in several other Masonic bodies, such as the York Rite Sovereign College, the Knights of the York Cross of Honor, the Red Cross of Constantine, the Allied Masonic Degrees, the Holy Royal Arch Knight Templar Priests, all of which require membership in a Royal Arch chapter to qualify. A lodge is defined as that hallowed ground where upright men may meet in harmony and frank good fellowship without fear of discussion of sectarian, political, or personal differences. A chapter is similar, except one must be a Master Mason to qualify for membership. I draw your attention to my mention of the American Rite. This distinction is necessary because there are different versions of the Royal Arch practiced by English, Scottish, and Irish constitutions. Each recognizes the other, but each offers their lessons in a different way. It is appropriate to state at this time that when the United Grand Lodge of England was formed in 1813, the preamble to the Act of Union stated that Freemasonry shall consist of 3 degrees and no more: Entered Apprentice, Fellow Craft, Master Mason, and the sublime degree of the Holy Royal Arch. Obviously, their arithmetic was not very good, but that is how it was written when inserted into the document. This, of course, defines the significance of the Royal Arch to craft Masonry. It is generally accepted that the first recorded indication of the term Royal Arch occurred in Ireland in the early 1700s. Next, we find records in Scotland and then in England. Immigrants from those countries, and especially military units posted to the colonies, brought the Royal Arch ceremonies to the east coast of America. Indeed, the number 2 lodge recorded in the Grand Lodge of New York is Independent Royal Arch Lodge number 2, which not only includes the name Royal Arch, but also claims to have had the right to confer the Royal Arch degree in its lodge, even after chapters were formed. As a member and past master of Independent Royal Arch Lodge number 2, I have conferred this degree in the lodge on more than one occasion. This lodge claims to have been instituted in 1760. Now, in those early days, the degree was only conferred in lodges because chapters had not been generally founded. However, by the time of the Revolutionary War, chapters were being formed throughout New England, New York, and down the East Coast, and lodges were no longer permitted to confer the degree. As the interest in the Royal Arch was developing in the colonies, two names become prominent in this process: Thomas Smith Webb and John Hanmer, who were at this time resident in Albany, New York. They had occasion to attend St. Andrew's chapter and Cyrus chapter in Boston, and discussions led to concern about two specific issues: standardization of the ritual and administrative government of the chapters. Thomas Smith Webb took it upon himself to transcribe a form of the ritual for the 4 degrees, and this is the foundation of the ritual still used today by American Rite chapters. Now, I carefully stated that Thomas Smith Webb took it upon himself to transcribe a form of the ritual. There are those who claim that he wrote the rituals. He did not. The rituals existed and were brought over from Europe and were transcribed from mouth to ear to various members in various chapters around the area, but he put them down in writing, so there was a consistency. Mouth to ear is great, but things do tend to get mixed up and changed along the way and don't always stick to what it was originally supposed to be. So Thomas Smith Webb did the great job of putting all of this down in black and white, so there was a consistency to the work. Discussions took place in Boston in 1797, and on January 24, 1798, in Hartford, Connecticut, a constitution was proposed and approved forming the General Grand Chapter of Royal Arch Masons, governing chapters in New England, New York, New Jersey, Maryland, and Delaware. Pennsylvania and Virginia determined not to join. Pennsylvania was so teed off that the guys up in the Northeast had not extended them proper invitations to come to the meeting, that they actually wrote it into their constitutions that they would never join General Grand Chapter. And they have held true to that. After only 1 year, it became evident that there were obstacles to proper performance of the administration due to the great distances involved, and it was decided to create grand chapters in each state, which would be subservient to the General Grand Chapter. Ephraim Kirby from Connecticut was the first General Grand High Priest, and Thomas Smith Webb was the first Deputy General Grand High Priest. Thomas Smith Webb devoted a good part of his life to General Grand Chapter, but for some peculiar reason, he never accepted the office of General Grand High Priest. He was always the Deputy General Grand High Priest, and he made great accomplishments in the institution of chapters around the developing state, as the country was developing, but he never took the office of General Grand High Priest. It's interesting to note that the General Grand Chapter is the first overall administrative Royal Arch body which was established several years before the Grand Chapters of Ireland, Scotland, and England were formed. This is particularly upsetting to the English. There have been 7 General Grand High Priests from New York State, the first being DeWitt Clinton from 1816 to 1829, John Livy Lewis, 1865 to 68, James McMurray Austin, 68 to 71, David Fisher Day, 1889 to 1892, Henry DeWitt Hamilton, 1927 to 1930, Robert F. Janes, 1951 to 54, and myself from 2011 to 2014. Curiously, Most Excellent Harold Janes and I have equal service credentials. We were both raised in Massachusetts. We both came to New York and affiliated with Independent Royal Arch Lodge No. 2. We both served as master there. We both went on to become district deputies of the 1st Manhattan District. We both were the head of all the other subservient York Rite bodies, the York Rite Sovereign College, the Knights of the York Cross of Honor, and finally, each of us became Grand High Priest and then General Grand High Priest. It's an amazing coincidence. I never had the pleasure of meeting with Robert Janes, but there were two members of Independent Royal Arch Lodge number 2 who I have spoken with who did remember him. Ed Kolb, who has since passed away, and our current senior past master. Give me a name, Harold. No, senior past master. George Hill. George Hill has talked to me about conversations he had with Robert F. Janes. Now, the General Grand Chapter, and especially its Deputy General Grand High Priest Thomas Webb, were instrumental in establishing chapters and grand chapters in new territories and states as they developed, and only chapters that were chartered by the General Grand Chapter were recognized. This structure continued until 1859, when a major change in the form of General Grand Chapter took place. At that time, 2 prominent leaders of the craft were senior officers in General Grand Chapter. You may recognize the names: Albert Pike, of Scottish Rite fame, and Albert Mackey, the famous Masonic historian and author. These 2 proposed that General Grand Chapter should turn over basic administration to the Grand Chapters, and that General Grand Chapter should be responsible only for the ritual and chartering of chapters and Grand Chapters. That proposal was passed at the subsequent triennial, and General Grand Chapter took on a new form that exists to this day. Growth and development continued through the USA as the country grew and developed without any significant policy events occurring until 1939, when Britain went to war with Germany. Our neighbor country to the north, Canada, being a part of the British Commonwealth, supported Britain in this military action. This moved the officers of General Grand Chapter as a mark of support to offer membership in General Grand Chapter to Canadian Grand Chapters under the same conditions as applied to Grand Chapters in the USA, and with the understanding that they could continue to use their own ritual and constitutions. The provinces of Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba took advantage of the offer, and they are still members today. Quebec joined for a few years recently, but elected to withdraw. In the 1800s, there were some small incursions of American Royal Arch Masonry into Latin America, but the first significant steps were taken as American entrepreneurs moved into Mexico and Central America in the 1950s and 1960s. Blue Lodge and Scottish Rite Masonry had existed there for many years, but the York Rite lagged behind. Mexico had an aversion to the Royal Arch because it was part of the York Rite, and the Yorkistas were enemies of the people during the Mexican Revolution, and this issue still festers today. In Europe, the Royal Arch was carried there by the English, Irish, and Scottish constitutions, and the American Rite did not appear in any substance until after the Second World War, when American military Masons brought the Rite with them. This, in fact, we have seated here tonight a Royal Arch Mason who took his degrees in Germany, David Menegon, I believe. This evolved rapidly through Germany, Italy, France, and Greece, and soon the American Royal Arch was being introduced to the needs of Europeans. Administrative decisions were made to enlarge the facilities of the General Grand Chapter to accommodate these new regions, and a regional Deputy General Grand High Priest was appointed for Europe and one for Latin America. Their first actions were to participate in the establishment of subordinate chapters which would function under the administration of the General Grand Chapter. When a minimum of 3 subordinate chapters were formed in a given jurisdiction, they could petition to form a Grand Chapter, all of course with the approval of the Grand Lodge in that jurisdiction. Over the years, since the end of the Second World War, American Royal Arch Masonry was introduced into France, Portugal, Austria, Germany, Italy, Greece, and after the fall of communism into Romania and Croatia. In Latin America, it appeared in Mexico, Guatemala, El Salvador, Panama, Colombia, Venezuela, Ecuador, Paraguay, and especially in Brazil. Certain Caribbean islands and countries also introduced the rite. The conclusion of the Second World War also brought American Masonry and Royal Arch Masonry to the Far East. Subordinate chapters were founded in Tokyo, Taiwan, Guam, and a grand chapter was formed in the Philippines, which continues to grow and prosper there to this day. There is also a regional deputy for the Far East. Just an aside for a moment concerning the Philippines. When I visited the Philippines, I had the opportunity to do something that I've only done once in my life and I had never seen done anywhere else before. I made a Mason, a Royal Arch Mason at sight. Now that's not something that is normally done. The reason for doing this was one doesn't go to the Philippines every day of the week. It's a little bit of a trek to get there. And the last day I was there, I met the Sovereign Grand Commander of the Scottish Rite. He had been out of the country and just returned the night before. So we made a special trip to go to his office just so that we could meet and introduce ourselves. And we talked about how it would be wonderful if he would support the Royal Arch and would he consider being a member? And he said he would. Well, that's a great move. And throughout many countries in the world, the Scottish Rite and the York Rite walk on different sides of the street and don't exhibit a harmony and unity that we do here in the USA. So when he agreed, I said, well, if you will agree to take the degrees formally at your convenience after I leave, I will make you a Royal Arch Mason at sight. So we did that in his office early one Sunday morning. And he went on to take the degrees, and I'm proud to say that the Scottish Rite and the York Rite walk hand in hand today in the Philippines. In many of these countries, the leadership of the Scottish Rite was not pleased at the introduction of the York Rite. Some jurisdictions tolerated this incursion, but others were resistant and made things very difficult for the York Rite Masons. This leads us to an important point in the goal of this presentation, to show how the York Rite in general and the Royal Arch in particular offer a very different perspective on international Freemasonry from that of the Grand Lodges or the Scottish Rite. Regular Grand Lodges are supreme in their jurisdiction, but there is no organization that has authority over Grand Lodges or which links them together. They all act independently, with no judicial controls. Granted, there exists the North American Conference of Grand Masters and the World Conference of Grand Lodges, but these are loosely controlled optional associations that have no real regulatory capacity over a Grand Lodge. Similarly, in the Scottish Rite, each jurisdiction has its own Supreme Council and Sovereign Grand Commander, but there's no authority over them. Although most come from origins in the Southern Masonic jurisdiction, I have found no leadership emanating from that body over any Supreme Council. So they're left to their own devices, and I am aware of some very unfortunate, serious disagreements which have occurred between the York and Scottish Rites. So now we come to the difference between the overall structure of lodges or Grand Lodges, the Scottish Rite and the York Rite, commencing with the Royal Arch. The General Grand Chapter forms a real link between American Rite Grand Chapters throughout the world. Each Grand Chapter that is a member of the General Grand Chapter has obligations to the General Grand Chapter, and the General Grand Chapter has obligations to serve the Grand Chapters. That puts us all under one umbrella that does not exist in the Grand Lodges or the Scottish Rite. The York Rite continues this concept into the cryptic councils, which are under the umbrella of the General Grand Council, and the commanderies of Knights Templar are under the governance of the Grand Encampment. There's a significant difference in the Grand Encampment, since the Grand Master of the Grand Encampment has authority over all Knights Templar in the Grand Encampment. We will only focus on the General Grand Chapter, since one must be a Royal Arch Mason in order to become a cryptic Mason or a Knight Templar. One of the most significant benefits of Masonry is the opportunity to visit other lodges and chapters, both at home and while traveling. I was introduced to traveling early in my Masonic journey. When I was a fellow craft in Republican Lodge in Greenfield, Massachusetts, I became aware that my uncle, living in Montreal, was master of his lodge, Fort Chambly Lodge number 67 in the Grand Lodge of Quebec. Actually, it's called the Grand Register of Quebec. I think it's the only jurisdiction in the world that uses that title. That's what they call it. It was not unusual for in many foreign jurisdictions for Masons to keep their membership secret. Hence, I had not known that my uncle was a Mason. It was arranged that my uncle would visit Republican Lodge to attend the conferral of my third degree. This was not to be, because my uncle died suddenly of a heart attack before the degree took place. On the occasion of the degree, a vehicle arrived at Republican Lodge from Montreal, bringing 4 brothers, friends of my uncle, to attend the ceremony as his representative. This was a big deal for our lodge in the little town of Greenfield, to receive a delegation not only from another lodge, but from another Grand Lodge and another country. It proved to be a great celebration, and the suggestion was made that the entire Fort Chambly Lodge should visit. And that is what transpired, with a return visit to Fort Chambly Lodge by a Republican Lodge in what developed into an annual exchange visit that went on for several years. My aunt donated my uncle's gavel as a traveling gavel between the 2 lodges. So this concept of visiting was instilled into me early in my Masonic experience and has been one of the most important parts of my life. I urge all Masons to pursue any opportunity to visit. Although when I was Grand High Priest of New York, I had some exposure to international Freemasonry in France due to my ability to speak French, although actually the French people don't accept that. They say I speak Québécois, which is a completely different language, but somehow or other they managed to understand. I learned to speak French when I was growing up in Montreal. And also I had a friend from El Salvador. I had the opportunity to visit El Salvador through a high priest of ancient chapter in New York, Dr. David Reyes Guerra, who had invited me to his home in El Salvador and to become acquainted with Masons and Royal Archmasons there. My first official appointment to an office in General Grand Chapter was in 2003, when the newly installed General Grand High Priest, Most Excellent J. Benny Allen from Georgia, appointed me to be the Regional Deputy General Grand High Priest for Latin America. Actually, I had to speak for him in Latin America because he spoke Georgian, and even people in New England didn't understand that, let alone the people in Latin America. This was an awe-inspiring responsibility for someone with limited experience in that region and for someone resident in New York City. But Benny Allen instilled certain concepts in me that I was eager to accept. He instructed me that we in General Grand Chapter were here to serve our members, and we were not to present ourselves as the ugly Americans who knew everything. We were to observe and listen rather than to dictate. Now, if you'll take yourself back to 20 years ago and 30 years ago, when Americans were able to travel more frequently than they had in the past, and there are far too many terrible stories of loud-mouthed Americans sounding themselves off and making themselves obnoxious and objectionable. That was what Benny Allen was concerned about. He wanted to make sure that we did not mimic that image, and we came across as people that were interested in them and cared about them. We were to observe and listen rather than to dictate. In some measure, my Canadian education contributed to my acceptance of this concept. Let me explain. Canada is a vast country geographically, but has a population of only about 10% of the USA. Hence, while Canadians are proud of their country, they realize that they are a relatively small country in the great scheme of things. Therefore, geography and history taught in the schools at that time was world geography and world history, rather than the more national presentations offered in most American schools. This gave me the Canadian perspective on the world rather than the American one, and this helped me tremendously in enlisting support in foreign countries with this more enlightened approach to spreading the light of Royal Arch Masonry. As I ramble along here, I beg leave to share a few stories of my personal experience that I hope will emphasize the power of the universality of Royal Arch Masonry. My first assignment in Latin America was to address some issues in Mexico, which was somewhat like sending David to meet with Goliath. Mexico has some 29 states, and as in the United States, each state has its own Grand Lodge. The Grand Chapter was essentially national for the whole country, but there are many other unrecognized Grand Lodges, so certain states have more than one Grand Lodge, one recognized, one not recognized. And it's very difficult for the young man thinking to become a Mason to know which lodge to join. And God forbid he joins an unrecognized one, he quickly finds out that he can't go visiting, he can't go with his friends who are members of the regular Grand Lodge, and this leads to a lot of dissension. While there are many fine Masons in Mexico, there is a tendency to be fractious. I was recently asked to offer a few thoughts at a symposium in Mexico on the subject of reconciliation, which was deemed to be a topic that every Mason in Mexico should study. The definition of reconciliation is the restoration of friendly relations. Certainly, the history of Masonry in Mexico has not been exemplified by the example of friendly relations. The issue at hand was a request from Grand Encampment to explore recognizing a dissident Grand Chapter that sought to become a part of General Grand Chapter. This would provide a new crop of potential Knights Templar for Grand Encampment. Several visits to Mexico City and meetings with Most Worshipful Carlos Quintanilla, the Grand Master of the Gran Logia Valle de Mexico, the most prominent Grand Lodge in Mexico, had resulted in an agreement that was broached so many times by the Gran Logia Valle de Mexico that they saw fit to expel me for being uncooperative, even though I was not a member of their Grand Lodge. I was General Grand High Priest when that occurred, and I wish to demonstrate the power of that office, because on the very next day, a fire broke out in the Grand Lodge of Valle de Mexico offices, so never underestimate the power of the General Grand High Priest. I'm pleased to advise that great strides have been made in Mexico, and just a few weeks ago, the current regional deputy for Latin America North, Humberto Guayez, who is from Guatemala, and incidentally will be here in New York in just a few days. He's having some very serious eye surgery done at Weill Cornell. So I'll have a chance to meet with Humberto, who's become a good friend of mine. Anyway, Humberto was able to barter an agreement for the two Grand Chapters in Mexico to work together. We pray that harmony will prevail and peace can be found in Royal Arch Masonry in Mexico. While this was going on, I also became involved in activity in Brazil. At the triennial in 2005 in Rapid City, North Dakota, Brazil had brought to our attention that some Royal Arch Masons from Portugal were trying to establish chapters there, even though it was the sovereign territory of the Grand Chapter of Brazil. We were able to resolve that issue, and that brought me into contact with Most Excellent João Guillermo Ribeiro, Grand High Priest of Brazil. No other Royal Arch Mason in Latin America can equate to the knowledge, wisdom, and experience in Masonry in Latin America of this fine gentleman. He is still a mentor to me. He became regional deputy following me and held the office for 3 trienniums. During this period, the Grand Chapter Brazil grew from 7 chapters to 120 at the last count. Including one named the Edmund D. Ted Harrison chapter, but that was only because they were hard pressed to find a name to name it, so thank you. An example of how the Royal Arch has spread harmony and universality is as the Royal Arch was growing in Brazil as a national body. There are, in each of the 26 states of Brazil, a Grand Lodge and a Grand Orient, together with a National Grand Orient of Brazil. So if you're living, whichever state you may live in Brazil, you have a choice of joining the Grand Orient, the Grand Lodge, or the National Grand Orient. Very confusing, for them as well as for me. While many of these bodies work harmoniously, there was much opportunity for argument and dissension. In many cases, high-ranking officers in the Grand Lodges and Grand Orients joined the Royal Arch chapter, which incidentally, the Grand Chapter of Brazil is national. It goes over the whole country. It's not broken up in states like the Grand Lodges. So high-ranking officers in the Grand Lodges and Grand Orients joined the Royal Arch chapter and even served as junior officers in the chapter. In João Ribeiro's second year as regional deputy, I was invited to attend a convocation in Rio de Janeiro. There, the Grand Master, who was also the president, that is, the governor of the state of Rio de Janeiro, convened an assembly in the House of Congress of the state under the banner of the Royal Arch, to which were invited Masons of all obediences and rites to gather under one roof in a sign of peace and harmony. This was the first time anything like this had taken place in Brazil. Senior Masons who had not ever thought they would experience such an event were shedding tears of joy as they joined hands in an expression of unity. And this Royal Arch harmony prevails today in Brazil. It's an example for the rest of the world. It's just tremendous what they accomplished there. Latin America offers an organization for Grand Lodges and Grand Orients designed to be a forum to deal with issues and to structure a solid foundation for the future. This organization is called the Confederación Masónica Interamericana, and in my opinion provides the best opportunity for government of Grand Lodges. It now includes several Grand Lodges from the USA, including the Grand Lodge of New York, and from Europe, the Grand Lodges of France, Portugal, Spain, and Italy. The General Grand Chapter is an official friend of CMI and is welcome at all meetings. At the last CMI triennial in Bolivia, there were only 2 speakers. Now, mind you, you have representatives of every Grand Lodge in Latin America, plus some from the USA, and some from Europe, and they only had 2 speakers for the whole conference. One was Right Worshipful Tom Jackson, the past Executive Secretary of the World Conference. The second was myself, representing General Grand Chapter. This is an example of how high in esteem the General Grand Chapter is held and reflects its harmony with the principles of CMI. In Europe, France was prominent in the growth of the General Grand Chapter, and it was from there that the most excellent Gerard Rayola was appointed regional deputy, a post that he held for 3 trienniums. During this time, Africa was added to his region, and 4 new grand chapters were chartered in Gabon, Togo, Madagascar, and Mauritius, while Cyprus was added in Europe. There are works in process now to add Slovenia, Poland, Serbia, and Slovakia. It was in Gabon that I experienced one of the most prestigious events of my Masonic experience when I was called to install the President of Gabon as Grand High Priest. This open installation ceremony was performed in the Imperial Palace before a host of local and international dignitaries, and I felt like a very small person in a very big room. In 2010, we became aware that the Grand Chapter of Austria was working an alternative ritual which was contrary to our Constitution, and so the General Grand High Priest revoked the Charter of Austria. Soon after my installation as General Grand High Priest, I was contacted by Most Worshipful Michael Kraus, the past Grand Master of the Grand Lodge of Austria, and the Grand High Priest of the Grand Chapter of Austria, seeking a way to overcome this situation so Austria could rejoin General Grand Chapter. Michael and I met and quickly found a solution by having a minimum of 3 chapters in Austria do their work in General Grand Chapter ritual. At the occasion of welcoming Austria back into the fold, I remarked in Vienna, Our goal is to advance Royal Arch Masonry, because this is the most important reason for us being here, to work together as companions. When you join a lodge, you become a brother, but you cannot choose your brothers. But you can choose your companion when you select a chapter to join, and that is what makes the difference in all of us. We are a united body that transcends political borders. At that occasion, I was invited to a private meeting with the Grand Master. We had a very pleasant discussion, and he was obviously very impressed with the attitude and action demonstrated by General Grand Chapter in receiving Austria back into the fold. He said he had a gift for me, but was somewhat embarrassed because it was a used book. But he felt the title of the book was particularly pertinent to the occasion, and he hoped I would understand. It was a book written by the good works done by the Allied nations in Europe following the end of the Second World War, and was entitled Light from the West. He felt that this same act was being done by General Grand Chapter in bringing light from the West to Austria, hence the explanation of the title of this presentation this evening. Please allow me to share a very personal story with you. One year, when I was attending the annual communication of the Grande Loge Nationale Française, at the banquet, I was seated beside Most Worshipful Gustavo Raffi, Grand Master of the Grand Orient of Italy. He did not speak much English, and my Italian is almost non-existent, but somehow during the evening, we were able to communicate, and I asked him where he lived in Italy, and he replied, Rimini. I responded that I had been to Rimini, and he asked why. I said to visit my father's grave. He had served in the Canadian Army in the Second World War and was killed there. He said, oh, then he must be buried in the Commonwealth Cemetery in Grudara. And I replied, yes. He then asked me to write my father's name on a piece of paper, which he put in his pocket, and that was the end of that conversation. About 6 months later, I received an email from the Grand Secretary of the Grand Chapter of Italy with a picture attached showing the 10 top officers of the Grand Chapter of Italy at my father's grave where they had placed flowers. That is an example of the universality of Royal Arch Masonry. Last year in Italy, I was present when a new chapter in my name was chartered in Anzio, and I was presented a vial of sand from the beach at Anzio as a token. The beach at Anzio was a major landing place of Allied forces in the Second World War. I've also been honored to have a chapter in my name chartered in France and one in Paraguay, linking us all under the Universal Royal Arch banner. I hope that this short history of the Royal Arch and these few personal anecdotes have been interesting to you. I'm so grateful to the great architect of the universe for having given me the opportunity to serve our royal craft over these past 50 years as a Mason. I cannot begin to mention all the extraordinary Royal Arch Masons who have guided me down this winding path, which took me to so many countries and sat me beside so many exceptional companions. My motto for daily living comes from a prayer in the Episcopal Prayer Book, which says, Lord, help me to do all such good works as thou hast prepared for us to walk in. This story reflects my attempts to follow that motto. Occasionally in the lodge, one will hear comment that the concordant bodies draw Masons away from the lodges. I beg to differ from that opinion. I rather say that when a Royal Arch Mason ties about his waist the red bordered apron of a Royal Arch Mason, he is symbolically tying about his waist the white lambskin apron of a Master Mason. For his first duty is now, always has been, and shall be forever, to the old Mother Lodge. For there he received the highest degree he will ever receive this side of paradise, the degree of Master Mason. The beautiful ceremonies through which you may pass in your progress to become a Royal Arch Mason, and the warm glow which bathes your soul at exaltation, carry with them a solemn obligation, that you take back to your Mother Lodge your newfound inspiration and illumination, for thus you will become a better Royal Arch Mason and a better Master Mason. Albert Pike states that Masonry's true and perfect morality is the morality of every creed in antiquity. Today, more than ever, the world needs Masonry, for Masonry equals truth. All religions and members of the human family acknowledging a supreme being are welcome at its altars. Royal Arch Masonry takes the best aspects of the craft and expands upon them, leading them, as it did the weary sojourners of ancient days, to travel symbolically from Babylon to Jerusalem, to join in the rebuilding of the city and temple of the Lord, the great example of universality in the craft. Let us go and do likewise. I have mentioned frequently this evening the subject of spreading light in Masonry. This is a particularly important part of the obligation taken by candidates in the most excellent master degree, to spread further light in Masonry. Hence it is foremost in the minds of Royal Archmasons. A few words which I have found also to be a motivation for me, especially when I think of all the devoted companions who have served to spread the light of Royal Archmasonry, but who may not be in leadership positions. I am reminded of this from the poetic phrase which states, "They also serve who only stand and wait." Why were the saints the saints? Because they were cheerful when it was difficult to be cheerful, patient when it was difficult to be patient, because they pushed on when they wanted to stand still, and kept silent when they wanted to talk, and were agreeable when they wanted to be disagreeable. That was all. It was quite simple, and always will be. To those who may be intrigued to learn more of Royal Archmasonry and General Grand Chapter, I refer you to the 4-volume History of Royal Archmasonry by Turnbull and Denslow. Although somewhat large, consuming 4 volumes, it is very readable and fascinating to those with an historical bent. Catherine Walter advises that this is available in the library. For those who are Royal Archmasons and seek to be better acquainted with the rite, I recommend the Capitular Development Course as offered by the Grand Chapter of New York and written by Most Excellent Piers A. Vaughan, past Grand High Priest of the Grand Chapter State of New York Royal Archmasons. It is the most readable and authentic modern book that I can recommend to you on this topic, and it is available online at www.lulu.com. Thank you for your attention and patience as I've meandered through parts of my Masonic journey, trying in some small way to bring light from the West. And now I close with a quote from the Order of Malta in Templary that reflects my belief in the royal craft, that this frail organization, though here subject to the many ills that flesh is heir to, possesses an immortal soul which shall soar to realms of endless bliss beyond the power of change to live forever. Thank you. Thank you very much. I really appreciate it. If anyone has